be live. As soon as that's done, we'll be live. Okay, I see that YouTube starts even before it tells you it started, but that's fine. Good Vach, Shavua Tov, hope you had a good Shabbos. We just concluded a 7-day journey of the laws of Deot. We started together last Motzei Shabbos, the laws of, I don't know what my colleagues called it, character refinement, values, attitudes to life, and so forth. And that took you through quite a range of various things which we did in the course of the past week. We now going to start a new unit together, which in fact is also a 7-day unit. That's laws of Talmud Torah, the laws of Torah study, and those begin with tonight and on Friday. It's a 7-day journey, and we're going to cover in the 7 days a range of laws related to study of Torah. As you'll see in a moment when we look at the text, there are 2 mitzvot that are connected with this concept. The one is the actual obligation of learning stroke teaching Torah, and we'll look at various aspects of that. If you watched my little intro that I posted a few minutes ago on the WhatsApp group, you will have seen the range of what the week covers. And then allied to that is also the respect that has to be accorded to Torah scholars, to teachers, and the laws that are associated with that, which will come towards the end of the week. And we'll get together again next Motzei Shabbos to start a unit, and that's a very fascinating one, which is the laws of idolatry, but more about that a little bit later. So laws of Torah study, what do we have in the laws of Torah study? We have the obligation to Torah study, learning as well as teaching. We have the mitzvah of who must teach, who may teach, who must learn, what must be learned, etc. So it's quite an interesting range of things. You would think it's quite simple. We have to learn Torah. But in fact, when we start looking at it in more detail, there's a lot of minutiae over there in terms of prioritizing your time as a teacher, as a student, and the interesting issue of whether one is allowed to charge for Torah learning. Also a very, very good question. So we're going to we're going to have a look at the actual text, and with all the halachot, we always begin with the intro, Hakdama, intro in Rambam, which is always, here we go. There we are. So the intro is always a listing of the mitzvot connected. There aren't very many in the laws of Talmud Torah. There are actually 2, as you can see, and they are both positive mitzvot or obligations. So mitzvah number 1, Rambam Hilchot Talmud Torah, Hakdama, the laws of Rambam, the laws of Torah study, introduction. I'm trying to just get the screen to fit. Okay, no. Okay, this should work. So laws of Talmud Torah, Hakdama, Hilchot Talmud Torah, Ishbichlan, Shtei mitzvot asay. We have in Talmud Torah 2 positive commands. Zeu pratan. Here's the detail. Okay, number 1, lilmod Torah, to learn Torah, and as part of that, we'll see is the obligation of teaching Torah. Allied, obviously, if you have to learn, then they have to be teachers. And then beit, lechabed melamdeha veyodeha, to honor the teachers and the knowers, to honor those who study it and know it. So a Torah scholar is given kavod, is given honor as a result of his scholarship. And obviously people who teach Torah in general, and particularly those who taught you Torah, you've got the obligation of showing a form of respect. And Rambam will deal with the consequences for not showing the respect that is due to a Torah scholar. That will be in subsequent chapters later in the week. And these mitzvot are explained in the following chapters. So interestingly, the way Rambam begins here is by talking about those who were exempted from Talmud Torah, which is kind of an interesting manner of starting a subject. There's a lot of discussion about that, which is beyond the scope of tonight's shiur. But Nashim, Avadim, Ktanim, Pturim mit Talmud Torah. Women, slaves, and males are free from the obligation of Torah study. So they don't have to teach Torah. Why is that? We will see in a moment that it's kind of connected. Teaching and learning are connected, and there is no obligation on minors, on women, or on slaves. Those are non-Jewish slaves, but because they're member of a Jewish household and they're owned by a Jewish master, they have certain mitzvah obligations, but this is not one of them. Women generally are exempted from all time-bound mitzvot or positive commandments that are time-related. Interesting question here. Why would they be exempted? Because about Torah study, it clearly says, you have to toil in Torah day and night, but nevertheless, there isn't the same level of obligation of Torah study for women. It doesn't mean that she shouldn't learn Torah, particularly when it comes to mitzvahs that are applicable to females. Of course, many of the mitzvot don't apply to females, that they're exempted from all the mitzvot that are the positive obligations, mitzvot I say, shazman grama, which are time-bound, which are connected with time, but there are many other mitzvot that a woman is obligated, and she's got the obligation of actually studying those laws as they relate to her, so she should know, what to do. We did mention that a minor is exempted from Torah study. Nevertheless, a father is obligated to teach his son Torah while he's a minor, as it states in Deuteronomy, you shall teach them to your sons to speak about them. So that was actually in last week's parasha and repeated again in this morning's Torah reading, and that is v'shinantam levanecha v'dibat bam. Same words in both the first and second paragraphs of the Shema. That is the mitzvah of teaching children Torah. So that obligation is there on the father. A woman is not obligated to teach her son, for only those who are obligated to learn, obligated to teach. So it is connected. Somehow the Gemara makes a link between the obligation of learning Torah and the obligation of teaching Torah, which means that essentially a woman doesn't have the obligation. Of course, in practical terms, most of the basic foundation in Torah that a child has will come from the mother rather than from the father. Shema bedi musar avicha. King Solomon says, my son, listen to musar avicha, to the teachings, to the musar that is taught by your father. Al titosh torati mecha, do not abandon the teachings of your mother, but the word there is torati mecha, the teachings of your mother. So in practice, the Torah of your mother, in practice, most of the child's knowledge will actually come, in the early years, particularly from the mother, who is usually spending far more time with her child. Here we talked about move on in chapter 2 to the obligation of ben beno. Okay, beno is his son, and then we have ben beno, which quite obviously means grandson. And just as a person is obligated to teach his son, so too he's obligated to teach his grandson, as it says, and you shall teach them to your sons and grandsons, and that was last week's parasha, I think. Hodatam levanecha velivnei vanecha. You need to teach those to your sons and grandsons. So there's an obligation clearly in the Torah that the teaching of Torah is not just to your direct generation, but beyond. Furthermore, this charge is not confined to one's children and grandchildren alone. Rather, it's a mitzvah to teach every wise man. It's a mitzvah for each and every wise man to teach all students, even though they're not his children. As it says in Devarim, you shall teach them to your sons. And the old tradition explains, your sons are your students, for students are also called sons, as it says in Kings. And the sons of the prophets went forth. Now, the sons of the prophets, they were not, the prophets were not all prolific parents who had many, many, many children. We talk about Bnei Nevi, we talk about student prophets. So we learn from there that the concept of ben can also refer to teaching. Ben Bnei Nevi'im are the sons of the prophets, or the prophets in training. And we actually have that in Rashi as well, when he talks about the offspring of Moshe, and it mentions Aaron's sons, and there Rashi mentions to us that although Aaron's biological children are referred to as Moshe's sons, because he was the one who taught them Torah, and from there would derive the principle that one who teaches children, it is like being banav, it's like being children. If so, why do commands explicitly mentions one's son and grandson and not everybody else, if the obligation is to teach everybody? That's a question of precedence, to give precedence to one's son over one's grandson, and one's grandson over the son of a colleague. So the priority will be that your first obligation is to teach your son. And then beyond that, your grandson, and beyond that, others. And obviously, if you are limited with time, resources, ability to teach, so your first obligation would be to prioritize teaching your own child. And then if your son is not teaching his children, then you will take over that duty. And if you got the ability to teach beyond that, then you teach children of others. Halacha number 3. Also, one is obligated to hire a teacher for one's son, while one is not required to undertake any expense to teach a colleague's son. So coming back to the question of why does the Torah kind of define teaching a son, teaching a grandson, teaching everybody, because you're obliged to incur expense to teach your own children. You do not have to incur an expense for other people's children. It would seem to imply or include also grandchildren. The person who was not instructed by his father is obligated to arrange for his own instruction of when he can understand, as Torah states, and you shall study them and take heed to perform them. Similarly, in every place, one finds that study takes precedence over deed, for study brings about deed. However, deed does not bring about study. I'll come back to that in a moment. So if your father failed in his obligation, you can't turn around and say, well, the mitzvah of my father's, so I'm an ignoramus in terms of Torah knowledge, but too bad, my father had to teach me, he failed to do that. I'm not obligated, the Torah doesn't say, so we have a separate obligation. You have to learn them, and you have to take heed to perform them. And in the last paragraph, Rambam says, study brings about deed. Deed doesn't bring about study, doesn't bring about knowledge. So it's important to learn in order to be able to know. So Talmud kodem l'maaseh. So you have to have study over deed, precedence over deed. It doesn't mean that you have to fully understand the significance and the deeper mystical meaning of a mitzvah before you're allowed to start performing it. You start performing the mitzvah immediately, but you have to learn before you start the mitzvah how to do it, and that takes precedence. What happens if you now have a choice between your own Torah study or teaching your child? If a person wants to study Torah and he has a son whom he should teach Torah, his study takes priority over that of his son. So he has limited resources or time. It's either he's going to teach his child or he's going to spend that time learning Torah for himself. So the halacha is clearly his study takes priority over that of his son. We're talking at a deeper level, on a basic level. You have the obligation of teaching your child enough to be able to perform as a Jew and know the basic halachot and so forth. But now we're talking where, put him through yeshiva, so to speak. He's now 25 years old, and the question is, you're ready to retire and go study in the kollel full time because you've made enough money in your business over the years. And your son says, well, I just got married and I'd like to study for the next 10 years in the kollel and widen my Torah knowledge. And the father has to make a choice. Does he carry on working and support his son's Torah study, or put a budget to his son, or does he rather carry on with his own Torah study? So your own Torah study will, in cases where it doesn't really jeopardize the future of your child's Jewish connection, take precedence. However, says Rambam, if the son is wiser and a more creative thinker and capable of understanding what he studies more than he himself is, his son is given priority. So if Torah is going to grow more, then give your son the resources to learn, because that's going to go further. But even though the son is granted priority, he should not neglect his own studies, because just as he's commanded to teach his son, he's commanded to teach himself. So there's an interesting and delicate balance between prioritizing, your own resources, how much you teach your child, or how much you help your child learn Torah, and your own study. Marriage and then Torah, or Torah and then marriage. So generally speaking, the way of the world is that our young men give themselves several years of study in yeshiva before they get married. In some cases, they get married younger. How do we decide which way to go? And quite clearly, a person is able to dedicate himself far better to Torah study when the Torah is his wife for the years that one is completely immersed in a yeshiva environment and studying Torah full time without the distractions of a wife you got to come home and have dinner with and spend time and care and affection and attention, and then obviously you get married and very soon children come along and they divert from your energies, from your resources and so forth. So a person should always study Torah, says Rambam, and afterwards marry. If he marries first, his man will not be free to study. However, if his natural inclination overcomes him to the extent his mind isn't free, he should marry and then study Torah. So the person now becomes, he's not going to be able to function as a normal human being because he really wants to start a family life. Then he should marry and then carry on learning to the extent that this is possible. In Halakha number 6, Rambam starts to discuss with us the age of Torah teaching. So when is a father obliged to teach his son Torah? From what age? And the answer is from when he begins to speak. He should teach him Torah, Tziva Lanu Moshe and Shema Yisrael. You begin as soon as he is old enough and whatever you can to teach, to learn Torah with the child, to teach him verses. In fact, the Rebbe introduced 12 verses, 12 pesukim, and Chazal, they're called, and statements of our sages, which we begin to teach our children at a very young age, even by rote, even though they don't understand the meaning, so that they're exposed to the words of Torah for a very young age. In fact, we start study before a child is able to teach, even though there may not be an obligation. We're quite aware that the environment that a child's involved in and exposed to the entire time, the entire time that he grows up, even from infant, definitely has an influence on the way he's growing up and the way he's going to develop. So just like some people have this idea of playing soft classical music because they feel that that's going to help with his development or her development as a young child. So we surround the child with Torah quotes, pictures, toys, etc. We play music of various psukim, etc. from a very young age. But as soon as the child's actually able to speak, then we start teaching him verses of the Torah, and then obviously the age of 3 is always deemed to be kind of a watershed moment in that that's when formal education begins over there, and that's when there's the custom of an upsharon and induction into Torah study, and from the moment we teach the child a bit more. Afterwards, you should teach him selected verses, little verse by verse, until he's 6 or 7, depending on his health. At which time we should take him to a teacher of younger children. So that's when kind of formal instruction begins, and little has changed in that we do begin formal school instruction at the age of 6 or 7. It is local custom in number 7 for a teacher of young children to take payment, and he should be paid if that's the custom. The father is obliged to pay for his instruction until he can read the entire written Torah. In a place where it's customary to receive a wage for teaching the written Torah, one is permitted to do so. Because here we have an interesting dilemma. It's a mitzvah. The Torah says you're obliged to teach Torah to your children and to your children's children, and then to the entire world. Are you allowed to charge for performing mitzvahs? Which is a little bit fresh of me to be discussing, because I think my entire life is dedicated to performing mitzvahs for pay, but let's not go down that road. Basically, there's a mitzvah to teach Torah. How can you charge? So Rambam says we can explain the practice, we can justify the practice if it is for the written Torah, and not only may the teacher charge, if that's a local custom. I don't know how they would set it up with it. The teachers don't get paid, and the father is obliged to pay. However, this is a thorny one. It's forbidden to take a wage for teaching the oral law as implied, but Deuteronomy 4:5, behold, I have taught you laws and statutes as I was commanded me. It's Moshe talking. And as sages say, Moshe was saying, just as I learned at no cost, so too have you been taught from me at no cost. Teach the coming generations in a like manner. Teach them at no cost, as you have learned from me. So that's a difficult one. Basically Hashem is saying to Moshe, I didn't charge you anything for this instruction which took place up here on Mount Sinai. And Moshe says to the Jews, I taught you in the same way, and we expect that you shall continue to teach future generations in the same way. So, nevertheless, a person cannot find someone to teach him at no cost. He must pay for his studies, as implied by Proverbs, buy truth, but he may charge to teach others, we learn, but do not sell. Thus it can be derived that it's forbidden to charge to teach Torah, even though one's teacher charged to instruct him. So that creates a little bit of a halachic dilemma. How do we charge for teaching Torah? However, there is a concept of schar batala. Basically, you're not able to perform any other job at that time. You need to sustain yourself. You're quite an intelligent individual. You could earn money getting involved. You could have studied anything else. You could have been bringing a living for your family. The fact that you're giving up on another source of lucrative income and you giving a Torah, you can be compensated for, which is how Torah teachers are obviously paid. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any of those. Not very much, I will add, but they do get paid. Every Jewish man is obligated to study Torah, whether he's poor or rich, whether his body is healthy or all afflicted by difficulties, whether he is young or an old man whose strength is diminished, even if he's poor. And he derives his livelihood from charity and begs from door to door. Even if he's a husband and a father of children, he must establish a fixed time for Torah study during the day and the night, as Joshua commands. It's a verse actually quoted earlier on. V'agita bo yamam v'layla. You need to think about Torah, engage in Torah day and night. So it doesn't make a difference what your level of income is and how much time you have. There has to be fixed time. Obviously, if you're free and you're able to learn day and night, then it's literally day and night. But if you cannot spend all your day and night learning Torah because you've got to go out and make a living, then there has to be a fixed time, both during the day and during the night where you study Torah. So you've got to set yourself a time when you're going to learn the daylight hours, and you're also supposed to set yourself a time when you learn during the night hours. Halakha number 9 talks about who has to learn. The greatest sages of Israel included woodchoppers, water drawers, blind men. Despite these difficulties, they were occupied with Torah study day and night. And were included among those who transmitted the Torah's teaching from master to student, the chain of stretching back to Moses, our teacher. I mean, if you think about the famous story of Hillel, who was so poor that he couldn't afford a couple of coins to be allowed into the Bet Midrash, where there were great lectures being given by visiting scholars, and he ended up lying on the on the roof, but there's a bit of an opening for light to come in, and skylight, and then came the light of day. They saw a human figure lying there, nearly frozen. So that was Hillel, and he kind of gave away with Mesirut Nefesh, with absolute self-sacrifice, made sure that he was studying Torah. Until when's a person obligated to study Torah? His entire life, until the day he dies, as the Chumash says, lest you remove it from your heart all the days of your life. Whenever a person is not involved in study, he forgets. 11, a person is obligated to divide his study time. What do you learn? So this is the way you do it. You divide it in 3. 1/3, the written law. 1/3, the oral law. And 1/3, the understanding, conceptualizing the ultimate derivation of a concept from its roots. Inferring one concept from another, comparing concept understanding of the Torah based on the principles of biblical exegesis, so one appreciates the essence of those principles and how the prohibitions and the other traditions one received according to the law of the old tradition we derive from them. I went very quickly through this because basically that's what you call, I was meant to only highlight this word, Gemara. Gemara is all of the above. It's taking the concepts of the oral law, understanding the concepts, how they are learned, midot shator and reshet bahena, the 13 exegetical principles of Rabbi Ishmael and so forth. So understanding how the Torah functions. Unless you understand how the laws are derived, you can't get to the next stage, which is to apply the laws when it comes to halakha, which is not exactly written in the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch. How will you know how to rule, how to make a decision, unless you understand the principles of how the is reached? How's the above expressed? So a person who's a craftsman may spend 3 hours each day involved in his work and 9 hours to Torah study. In those 9 hours, he should spend 3 reading the written law, 3 the oral law, and 3 meditating with his intellect to derive one concept for another, which is Gemara. The words of the prophetic tradition are considered part of the oral law, the explanation part of the oral. So written law and the explanation part of the oral law. So the words in Torah should be chtav, including the words of the prophets. That's called the written law. The explanation is the oral law, and the matters referred to as parades are considered part of the Gemara. Of course, parades is an acronym for Pei, Reish, Dalet, Samach, Pshat, Remesh, Drush, and Sod. The literal interpretation, allusions, Drash, which is exegesis, and Sod, which is the more hidden meaning of the, and that's all part of the Gemara. The above applies in the early stages of a person's study. Okay, when a person's knowledge increases, then you can kind of shift a little bit from the third. One doesn't have the need to read the written law as much, occupy himself with the oral law constantly. He should study the written law and the oral tradition at designated times. Thus, he will not forget any aspect of the laws of the Torah. He should focus for his attention on the Gemara alone for the entire life, according to his ambition and his ability to concentrate. So you find that scholars actually are spending most of their time studying Gemara, not neglecting the oral law, not neglecting the written law, but really putting most of the emphasis on the Gemara. And finally, to conclude tonight's shiur, a woman who studies Torah will receive reward. It's not like she shouldn't study, and she will receive reward. The reward will not be as great as a man, since she was not commanded in this mitzvah. And whoever performs a deed which is not commanded to do does not receive as great as reward as one who performs a mitzvah is commanded to do. It's always more difficult to fulfill a mitzvah when you're told to do it. We all know how we're feeling about the restrictions government has placed on us, on movement, etc. And you're resentful because everyone thinks that we're grown up, so we can decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. And when it becomes law, it becomes difficult, and we want to resist. So the reward for doing a mitzvah when you're obliged to do so, rather than when the Yetzer Hara gets in the way and tries to stop you from doing it, rather than the mitzvah, the reward for a mitzvah that you're doing of your own free will is not as great. And this is, where this comes in. And that's why, when the mitzvah of the bracha we say in the morning, Shavasani Yisha, is sometimes seen in a very bad light, but it's basically a man saying, thank you Hashem for the many obligations we were given, in addition to those that were given to women, because as a result of that, we have the ability to perform mitzvah we commanded. Even though she will not receive a reward, the sages commanded a person shouldn't teach his daughter Torah. So even though she will receive a reward, because most women cannot concentrate their attention on study, thus transform the words of the Torah into idle matters because of their lack of understanding. So we're talking in different culture from the one that we're living in, where women were, not educated in any matters at all, basically remained at home and were given a very limited exposure to the outside world. Teaching a woman in that kind of environment would cause the words of Torah to not end up being applied correctly because of lack of understanding, and therefore, and there's still some cultures in which this is kind of followed even today. So our sages declared whoever teaches his daughter Torah is like one who teaches her tales and parables. This applies to the oral law. The written law, one should not teach one's daughter. If he teaches her, it is not considered as if she was taught idle things. So there are definitely some cultures, some movements within Judaism today where the study of Torah by women is shunned, and they stick to the written law, to the Tanakh only. Nonetheless, more and more Torah study is something which is being, studied equally by men and by women, and in many cultures, many groups within the Jewish people. At the moment, Gemara is being taught to women without restriction. I think it was even a generation ago, kind of shunned. You could teach everything, but not Gemara. But I think those restrictions have fallen away. My daughter, who's in grade 11 at Torah Academy, has a Gemara class 2-3 times a week. So it's kind of really changed. So we understand it was a Rambam based on the Gemara as going back to days when there was a different approach to female education. Now that women are being given full education in secular matters, so the problem of a Torah study would clearly be, not the wise thing, and the idea of teaching a woman Torah would be considered teaching her idle things. Are definitely, is not something which is applicable nowadays. So that concludes chapter 1 the laws of Talmud Torah. Lovely to see you. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to stick to 7:30 still next week, but from the following week, we're going to be at 8 o'clock, and that's to accommodate our participants from Cape Town. I see at least one. The rest of you get the cameras off, so I don't know who you are. Have a wonderful week. Please join my colleagues on Sunday to Friday. I think tomorrow it's 11 a.m. and the rest of the week it's 1 every day. And by Friday you'll be done with the laws of Talmud Torah. Join me next Motzei Shabbos 7:30 for the laws of Avodah Zarah, the prohibition against worshipping idols, which will be a fascinating discussion. We'll start then.